Greetings, Journeyers. Welcome to the first episode of Reedkeeper's Journey, a novel adapted into a serial podcast written and read by Mark Diaz. Thank you for taking the time to check out my podcast, and if you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. And away we go. Chapter 1. Michael Reed debated whether or not he should sneak back into his room and go to bed. He raised his hand for the umpteenth time, paused, and again let it fall back to his side. The cold had seeped into his shoes and snaked its way down his collar, but he wasn't quite ready to go to bed just yet. But I should, he whispered to himself. It's late. I'm cold. And it's a school night. He reached out to the window, but instead of palming the glass and quietly easing it upward, the tip of his finger traced the horizontal crack that ran the length of the glass. A ruined window. And for what? He bet Jack couldn't even remember why he had thrown him against the wall, and with enough force to crack the glass. His biological donor, Michael, refused to call that man father, had shot him an accusatory look and stomped out of the room. Michael had just sat there, ears ringing, and slightly amazed he had not gone completely through the wall. A possible concussion and a broken window, all because Jack had not liked Michael's what? His tone? His look? His face? Pathetic, Michael thought. He knew there wasn't any rhyme or reason to his parents' outburst. Jack didn't need a reason. He just needed a target. And Michael always made sure he was a much better target than his little sister Stacy. A car shot down Santa Isabel Freeway. Their dinky house didn't really sit on a freeway, but without streetlights or stop signs, people drove like it was. When she got bored, Stacy would sit on the porch and yell at cars to slow down. She had started doing that when she was about 10. Not much had changed in the past 4 years, but she kept on shouting. Michael didn't think it was about the cars anymore. Sometimes she just needed something to yell at. Another car. He watched his shadow dance across a house at 50 miles an hour. The sound of cars passing always made him think of waves, and waves made him think of Vicky. Their fifth and final date had been at Morro Bay. She had made things quite clear 6 months ago, with the waves shattering all around him at the base of Morro Rock. Michael sighed. It had been a crappy way to end summer vacation. His last summer vacation. And now the shadow of their ruined relationship darkened his last school year. It was just too much to deal with. The lousy house, Vicky, Jack. Ugh. He kept telling himself that in 6 months he could say goodbye to this crappy little town with its crappy little people. But in his heart he knew he couldn't abandon his little sister. Stacy needed him. A cold breeze blew and reminded him that it was 35 degrees outside, much too cold for his California blood. An exhalation of warm air briefly surrounded him as he finally slid his bedroom window open. The house slept. He exhaled one last white breath and slipped into his room. He stripped down to his boxers and hurriedly got into bed. He curled his body beneath the covers and tried to rub some warmth back into his legs and feet. He had been a lot colder than he realized. As the heat slowly crept back into his extremities, Michael's exhausted mind wondered if the woman with the eyes would be waiting for him. Michael Reed found himself standing in a lush meadow, half-mooned by ancient yet vibrant trees. Light dazzled off the sandy-bottomed stream that cut the meadow into a semicircle. A hot breeze caressed his cheek like an endearing kiss from Mother Earth. He shaded his eyes against the blinding sun and a sky so blue he could scarcely behold it, letting the stillness roll over him in waves. He felt at peace. The intoxication of the emotion nearly brought him to tears as brilliant sunbeams chased the shadows from his soul. Michael shed the weight of his life like an old skin, and for the first time in what seemed like years, he remembered what it felt like to be at ease. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he squinted at the near blinding stream. A playful smile crept across his lips. Heedlessly, he peeled down to his boxers and dashed for the inviting water. His feet left the ground, and he hung in the baking summer air for an instant. He plunged. Needles stabbed at him as every pore in his body contracted from the fierce cold of the water. His feet touched sand, and he pushed off. He broke the surface, laughing. Droplets that glistened like jewels in the sunlight rained about him as he shook the water from his head. He waded out of the stream, shivering and smiling like an idiot. "Too cold for your liking?" A soft voice whispered in his ear. Michael's head snapped up. Across the clearing, a woman in a white dress casually leaned against a gnarled oak. She seemed magnified, as if the world was a reflection and she was the reality. A coy smile played across her inviting lips as up high a lone cloud drifted in front of the sun. The breeze quickened a warning against his neck. "Just a little," he muttered, and quickly began wiping the excess water from his arms. He could feel her eyes, and somehow Michael knew exactly what they looked like. They were blue, almost transparent, like those of a blind man he had once met as a child. Those eyes had disturbed him then, too. She pushed her slender form from the tree with a slight arc of her back. With an unsettling grace, she started towards him and cooed, "I like the cold." With eyes like that, Michael didn't doubt it. As if spurred by his thought, more clouds strayed in front of the sun. The cold wind blew. He nodded towards his clothes. "If you don't mind." Her pace didn't falter. "I don't." "Well, I do," he muttered as he shoved a wet leg into his pants. He yanked his shirt over his head and tried to rub the chill from his arms. Black clouds were now consuming the sun, and the growing wind refused to allow him any warmth. "Why didn't I bring a jacket?" he thought. The woman continued to cross the meadow, and with each step his uneasiness grew. She was pretty, gorgeous in fact, tall for a woman, he thought, with long flaxen hair that framed a full, rich face. Her deep red lips set with a sly, knowing smile. But those eyes! He took an instinctive step back and tried to convince himself that he was only trembling from the cold. "Why, Michael, do I make you nervous?" She feigned hurt, but her icy smile grew. "Do I know you?" Ominous black clouds, driven by the increasing gale, had now devoured the sky. Michael continued to back up slowly, refusing to take his eyes off her. She laughed joylessly. "Everyone knows me. They just don't always recognize me at first." He felt like he did know her, but he could not imagine how he could forget those eyes. They were like a razor being drawn slowly across a lip. The thought of insects slipping into his ear to lay eggs while he slept slithered through his mind. The gale whipped at the treetops and flattened the grass. The sky was locked in battle as more clouds stormed in and obliterated all hints of blue. Thunder rolled like cannon fire in the distance, an omen of destruction to come. A tree met his back, halting his retreat. "Who are you?" She drew closer. "No one of immediate consequence. Unless." "Unless?" Michael felt the tree thrumming from the wind through his back. "Unless you choose me to be so." She was 3 strides away now. The choice is yours. Her hair was motionless in the blasting wind, and her transparent gown didn't stir. Michael wanted to bolt, but her eyes held him, piercing him as they smoldered with some hellish light. They didn't seem to belong to her. It was as if someone watched him through her body. If looks could kill sprang to his mind. He bit his cheek to keep from laughing hysterically. What do you want? Same as everyone else. Peace. The blasting gale whipped his hair about, pulling at his clothes and freezing the sweat to his face, but it didn't touch her. A raging tempest now gripped the meadow. Will you give me peace, Michael Reed? Her whisper sliced through the torrent as she cupped his face with a delicate hand, nails biting into his flesh. He wanted to scream. The windstorm now thundered with such force that the tree he pressed against threatened to uproot. A lightning bolt slammed into the ground close enough to lift the hair on his body. Suddenly, it came to him. No! The hurricane tore the words from his throat before they could reach his ears. No peace! A twisted grin contorted her lovely face. Nails dug deeper into his flesh. Blood streamed down his cheek, webbing itself across his face. That is your choice? Her voice was like an open grave. He tried to nod, but she held him like a vice. He knew the creature that owned those eyes, something twisted and cruel that lurked in his nightmares. She raised her hand, the razor-sharp nails growing longer. Wait. Nightmare! It's a nightmare! Michael clawed his way to consciousness. It struck. Talons gouged the bark where Michael had stood a heartbeat ago. She was no longer smiling. Michael stumbled to his feet and staggered through the dark to his bathroom. He fumbled with the faucet and winced as he splashed cold water over his head. Trembling fingers touched his face and came back red. He peered into the mirror, and even in the moonlight, he could clearly make out 5 small incisions on his cheek. Fingernails. He emptied his stomach in the toilet. Michael Reed spent the rest of the night staring at his bedroom ceiling with the light on. Chapter 2. Michael moved into the mass of people filling the hall and negotiated his way to his locker. He dropped off his books. It was lunch period, but he didn't even glance at his sack lunch. His stomach evidently had not recovered from the realization that sleep was no longer safe. The sun shone bright, but he still scanned the sky for threatening clouds. Conversations filled the quad, consisting mostly of the boring details of the dreary teenage existence that was the 1980s. Michael envied the bored. He made a beeline to the last table in the open-air cafeteria. His best friend, Ken Cavalier, was there, along with Samuel the Bear Williams. Ignoring the bench, Michael took a seat on the table, and as he sat, he watched Bear fumble to peel an orange that really looked more like a tangerine in his thick hands. "What's up with your face?" Ken asked around a mouthful of peanut butter and jelly sandwich. "I'm an abused child. What's your excuse?" Michael forced a casual smile and almost burst out in nervous laughter. He knew he deserved the weird look that Ken gave him. Even Bear glanced up from his fruit, his dark eyes showing concern. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Bear said. Michael was saved from having to reply by the approach of his other best friend, Steve Voss, with his current girlfriend in tow. Michael corrected his observation. Heather Shackelford didn't strike him as a type of person that would ever be in tow with anyone. "What's the haps, gentlemen?" Steve asked, jovial as ever. He squinted at Michael. "How in the world did you do that?" he asked, pulling his blonde shoulder-length hair into a ponytail. That hair was Steve's pride and joy. If anyone ever asked him why, he would wink and say, "Chicks dig it." Michael reckoned what chicks did or didn't dig was probably the primary motivator of his friend's life. "The cat jumped on me in my sleep." It almost came out as a question, as if he were asking if they would believe him. "When did you get a cat?" Ken probed. I thought your dad wouldn't let you have pets. Jack doesn't, but Stacy found a kitten and snuck it in the house. She said she knows someone who wants it. Michael lied. He hated doing it, but everyone would think he was crazy. Maybe they would be right. Heather reached forward and cupped his face in her slender hand. Cat scratches can be bad. She turned his head and peered at the small cuts. You better put some peroxide on those. They could become infected. Sure. He pulled smoothly away, hoping no one made the connection between her fingernails and the cuts on his face. He suppressed a shudder at the thought of how close that thing had been to his throat. I think we may have found a new spot, Ken spoke up. Michael sighed, relieved as the attention turned away from him. Well, I don't know if it's worth anything yet, but it looks promising. Steve leaned forward, his hazel eyes sparkling with interest. Where? Down by the river. I practically fell on it. It's a hole almost 2 feet wide, and I could hear water running down below. Could you see the bottom? Steve asked. No, it was too dark, but I'm sure it's a good find, Ken assured, brushing his brown hair from his eyes. We should check it out tomorrow. Today. Steve's tone left no room for discussion. Think you can make it, Mikey? Michael's cuts began to itch, and he scratched at them unconsciously. Sure. Will you give me peace? What about you, Bear? Steve asked. Bear was a member of the unfortunate club that experienced their growth spurt in the 6th grade. By the 9th grade, he was 6'4", and now, as a senior in high school, he was finally growing accustomed to his body. The varsity football coach had hounded him for 3 years, until he realized the big guy didn't house a violent bone in his body. When he arrived from Fresno as a freshman, Steve had been the first to befriend him, and soon had everyone calling the new kid Bear. I'll have to do it after my chores, he replied. Chores? Well, all right, as long as you can make it. But we should really talk. Steve shook his head in bafflement. Chores. How about you, Heather? Ken asked. Probably not, she hesitated. You really should come along, Ken insisted, absently scratching at his chest. It's not really my thing. She wavered as she looked at Steve. Come on, it's easily the best thing since cow tipping, Steve grinned. Well, with an endorsement like that, she rolled her eyes and smiled. How could I refuse? Cool. When this diabolical excuse of a school is over, we'll all meet at Ken's house, Steve finalized. Gee willikers, that word of the day calendar is really paying off, Michael joked. Steve raised spirits wherever he went. His cheerful disposition even took its toll on Michael's more realistic outlook. Popular, smart, and charming were the 3 words most often used to describe the short shrift named Steve Voss. Indubitably, it has proved itself most fortuitous, Steve parried. We better make it the bridge. Ken brought the group back to the discussion at hand. If we all meet at the house, my mom's going to start asking questions. Michael understood. Since Ken's dad had died a few years ago, his mother had become increasingly protective. Michael wondered what was worse, losing a father that loved you or having one that hated you. The bridge isn't too far, so Ken and I can just walk down and meet you there, Michael said. Works for me. Now, if you gentlemen don't mind, Steve's infectious smile broadened. My honey and I have some unfinished business to attend to. Heather shook her head. You make it sound so bad. We're working on a research paper, she explained over her shoulder as Steve pulled her away. Nothing else. Michael watched the two go. It always seemed so easy for Steve, with girls and with life overall. Of course, Steve would joke and say that he would trade it all to be 5'10". Still, there was no denying the ease in which his friend glided through life. His parents were lawyers, so money was never a problem, and he had a new girlfriend every other month. Although, lately it was obvious that Heather was something different. Steve had a way of looking at her that spoke volumes. You're better off, man, Ken encouraged as he popped a cracker into his mouth. Ken had caught him watching the couple go, and for the millionth time,
Michael wished his feelings weren't so transparent.
Yeah, your ex was problematic at best, Bear said. Michael knew that it was true. His short-term romance with Victoria Hackle had been one headache after another. But against all common sense, he still missed her. Michael forced himself to shake it off, assured himself that love had a noxious rank about it, and turned to Ken. So, tell me about the cave. The first tunnel was discovered 2 years ago at the end of their sophomore year, the last summer of true freedom for a teenager, before the expectations of the real world came crashing down. It's a brief time when the childlike nature has not yet fallen prey to the demands and the monotony of adult life. Michael and Ken had stumbled across an entrance to the town's underground waterways. Culverts were extensive tunnels built under a city to control water runoff from the roads. Exploration was, of course, in order, and soon they had mapped out all the town's tunnels and even some in the neighboring city of San Luis Obispo. Now, everyone kept their eyes open for new sewer tour opportunities. Michael knew that it was a little childish, and probably more than a little dangerous, but it was the one thing that Jack knew nothing about. It was the only piece of his life that was truly his, and when they were exploring, the world and his troubles and Jack could never reach him. So, like I said, Ken shrugged, I couldn't see much. What could you see? Michael asked. It was under a log, Ken answered. It was like I was walking along and I thought I saw something under a log. I rolled it over and I found the hole. Well, how deep was it? Bear probed. Deep enough to make it worthwhile. You were looking for caves in the riverbed? Michael asked. I wasn't looking. I was just hiking down the river and I came across it. He wadded up his lunch sack and then added sarcastically, if I knew there was going to be a test, I would have studied. Michael let it go. Something had obviously been eating at his friend for the past month. He glanced at his watch. The day was half gone, and he hadn't a clue of what he was going to do to face the night. He shouldn't go exploring. He should be trying to figure out how to stay alive, or at the very least, awake. He scratched at his cheek. Will you give me peace? Maybe we'll get lucky and they'll scar, pretty boy, Ken joked. Then Bear and I can have a chance with the girls. Yeah, right. Michael rubbed a drop of blood between his thumb and forefinger. All Bear has to do is flex, and they come running. His big friend barked a laugh. The rest of the day passed swiftly and without event. Michael rode his bike home after school. Steve had offered him a ride, but Michael declined. Riding helped him clear his head, and he had a lot on his mind. He pumped his legs furiously to the rhythm of his racing thoughts. The only solution he could fathom was just to stay awake. But eventually he would doze off, and the woman with the eyes would be waiting for him. Could he have scratched himself in his sleep? Nightmares had always been a problem, but they were normal nightmares. They were created by a poor teenage diet and too many horror movies. When that psycho hose beast had showed up in his dreams 6 months ago, everything had changed. His nightmares had become increasingly violent and terrifying. He knew it could only get worse. He pumped harder, spurned by his helplessness. He reached the house in record time. Stacy, his younger sister by 3 years, was waiting on the porch. Slow down! Stacy yelled at a passing car. Where's Mom? He dropped his bike on the lawn and headed for the house. Another doctor's appointment, remember? She stood and dusted off her pants. Their mother, the perpetual hypochondriac. Oh, yeah, right, I forgot, he said as he headed to the house. Stacy caught the screen door before it slammed behind them. Well, hi to you too, she replied, following him in. Not now, Stace. He grabbed his spelunking backpack from the top shelf of his sister's closet. It was a well-known secret that Jack searched his room periodically. I have to get going. Cavalier found a new cave, he explained as he headed to the front door. Cool. Can I come? She asked. Michael stopped on the porch. Why? I'm bored,
She shrugged absently, twirling a strand of her reddish-brown hair. I guess. He locked the door and started across the lawn. Will we be back before dark? She asked. Probably, Michael said. We better, she said. You know how Dad gets. Jack can go to hell. He snapped with uncharacteristic heat. The cuts on his face seemed to pulse with his temper. Coming? Jeez, Stacy said, completely unfazed by his temper. What crawled up your butt and died? Don't start on me, Stacy, he warned. Are you coming or what? Yeah, she started after her older brother. I'm coming. After a few minutes of walking, Michael spied Ken waiting on the steps of his apartment. His arms were wrapped around his knees, and his eyes were glazed in deep thought. Ken, Michael spoke up after an impatient moment. Ready to go? Ken shook himself. Yeah. Hey, Stacy, Ken greeted. How's the kitten? What kitten? Look, are we going to do this or what? Michael interrupted. Ken paused. You know, if you guys don't want to do this, it's cool. I mean, it'll probably take a while, and you know how your dad gets. Michael wiped a scowl off his face. Everyone knew how his dad got, but no one did anything about it. Yes, he answered. I'm sure. All right, if that's your choice. Ken slung his gear over his shoulder and paused. You okay? I'm fine, Michael said, starting off for the bridge. I was just reminded of a dream I had last night. Steve, Bear, and Heather were waiting for them at the Kerberell Bridge. So, Steve asked impatiently as the trio arrived. So what? Ken deftly rebutted. So, where is this place? Not too far from here, Ken assured. Then lead on, oh fearless one. Steve flourished a bow, and they all followed Ken down the slope to the dry riverbed. You're such a nerd, Stacy said, and Steve laughed. True, Bear smiled as he walked beside Stacy, but he's a rich nerd. I'm not rich. My parents are rich, Steve countered. Rich kids always say that, Heather said. They walked down a well-beaten path crisscrossed with ATV and motorcycle tire tracks. Here the riverbed spanned a good 300 yards across. For his entire life, Michael had never seen the Salinas River as anything more than a sand-choked stream. Weeds filled the sandy riverbed and encroached at the stream's edge like an army laying siege. Twisted oak trees scattered the area like frozen plumes of smoke. Michael found it hard to believe that this area ever contained enough water to carve a huge swath throughout the length of California. Doesn't the Salinas River flow backwards or something? Michael asked. It flows north, Bear answered. There are only a couple that do. I know the Nile is one of them. I know the Amazon flows backwards seasonally. Why? No reason. It just seems weird, Michael said. God's creativity confuses man, Bear said to himself. What's that? Stacy asked. Nothing, Bear said, a little embarrassed. Just something my dad always says. There it is, Ken announced, pointing to a fallen tree. It's not very big, Voss said disappointedly. That's what she said, Ken blurted, then had the decency to look embarrassed as he glanced at Heather and Stacy. I never said it was big, just deep, Ken defended as they approached. Michael peered into the hole. It was a little less than 2 feet in diameter. He could clearly hear the sound of water rushing in the darkness below. It seemed odd. It looked as if something had punched a hole in the earth. He could not figure out how it could have formed naturally. Then again, he couldn't understand how a river could flow backwards, if only seasonally. I can see a little ground down below. Looks like a 14-foot drop. He stood. Who's first? I'll go. Steve piped up. Do you have to? Michael heard Heather whisper. Don't worry, hon, he answered just as quietly and pulled out his repelling harness. He was the only person in the group who could afford one. Michael will make sure nothing happens to me, right, partner? I don't like it, Michael said, ignoring his friend's insinuation that he was eavesdropping. It doesn't seem right to me. Steve slapped him on the back. Michael, my friend, you read way too much Stephen King. This ain't scary. Just be careful, Michael lowered his voice. For once. Steve paused, and a strange, somber expression spread across his face. He looked at Michael and said, just this once. Michael handed him a flashlight and began securing the line to the harness. Just take a look around and see if you can find anything to stand on. No prob. You just make sure you have a good grip on that rope. Steve gave Heather a peck on the cheek since she flatly refused to be kissed in public, and reassured her that he would be perfectly safe. Despite his friend's sincere efforts, Michael didn't feel any less worried, and Heather didn't look it. Michael tossed the line to Ken. Wrap this around the trunk, and we'll lower him down. Steve turned on the flashlight and wormed his thick torso into the hole. He was only 5'4", but years in the swim club had given him a solid frame. Michael held the line securely, all too aware of Heather's watchful gaze. Just tell us how much you need, Michael said, as Steve's head disappeared into the hole. Michael stared at the hole that the taut line ran into. Something nagged him about it. It just didn't seem natural. An urban legend came unbidden to his mind. A man back east had lost 2 dogs into a mysterious hole. When his friends lowered him down to retrieve the dogs, he started screaming bloody murder. When they pulled him back up, his hair had gone completely white, and he was totally insane. Whatever he saw down in that hole was enough to drive him mad. Michael didn't believe a word of it, but nonetheless, the story always gave him the chills. Looking at the hole that had just swallowed his friend, Michael had an overpowering sense that the earth was dark and menacing. For centuries, people had taken all that was precious out of the land and replaced it with bloodshed and the remains of their dead. Did the evil of man seep into the ground to corrupt the earth? Or did the soil feed off the death of all things? The flesh on the soles of his feet began to crawl. Steve was right. He did read way too much Stephen King. What's it like? Kevin shouted over Michael's shoulder, practically making him jump.
More slack.
The hole answered back. The maw ate more rope. Well? Ken's voice tensed.
Keep it coming until I say so.
Steve sounded far away. He wants more, Michael relayed back to Bear and Ken. Yeah, but is it any good? What does it look like? Ken muttered. Steve, what do you see? Michael yelled, feeling Ken's anxiousness creep into his own skin.
Hold on.
And a moment later,
The hell?
a sharp yell shot out of the hole, and the line went limp. Michael and Heather leapt forward on hands and knees, thrusting their faces in the darkness, and almost bashed their heads together. Steve, they said with one voice. Nothing. Michael couldn't see anything except a small circle of sand with 2 footprints that were illuminated by the light pouring into the opening. I can't see him, Heather almost cried. His cuts itched furiously. She's down there. The woman with the eyes is waiting for me in the dark. He took a deep breath and stuck his head in there to call for his friend.
I'm fine,
Steve finally answered, laughing.
Did I scare you?
Jerk, Michael thought, and he didn't hesitate to say so. He'll wish he broke his legs when I get a hold of him. Heather growled, and Stacy nodded in agreement. Bear and Ken just looked relieved.
Looks like we hit the mother lode, gentlemen. And ladies,
Steve yelled.
The Salinas is an underground river, all right, but there's a dry shore on this side, and it goes as far as I can see.
It was only when Steve verified the excellent find that Michael realized he was hoping the whole thing was a bust.
I'm free. Pull up the harness,
Steve yelled. Stace, you can go next, and then Heather, Michael said. Stacy nodded her consent. But Stephen's girlfriend gave the hole a dubious look. It'll be fine, Ken insisted. We do this all the time. That wasn't exactly true. They had only used a harness twice before, but Michael didn't see how the exaggeration could do any harm. Don't worry, Stacy assured. If there was any real danger, my brother wouldn't let me go near it. Michael nodded. That was definitely the truth. They lowered down one by one into the hole without further event, other than Steve receiving a well-deserved punch in the arm from Heather and Bear getting a little stuck. Michael was the last to go. As he prepared to rappel down, he stopped and looked around. He breathed deeply. The world was beautiful. Despite all the ugliness and death that the people brought to the planet, nature still persevered, and it was a thing of breathtaking beauty. The sun rays were slanting through the surrounding trees, igniting the dust motes. He marveled how light could travel through the freezing emptiness of space and still warm him on a quiet sandy bank. He breathed deeply again. He calculated that he had roughly an hour before dark. Plenty of time, he thought. I'll be back before Jack even knows I was gone. As he clutched the rope and lowered himself down into the sound of rushing water, the cuts on his face began to pulse.
Thanks for listening, Journeyers. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it and leave a review. Visit Reedkeeper.com for additional information like show notes and a deeper exploration of the characters and the world they inhabit. There, you can submit fan art or questions you may have that I will answer if I can without giving too much away. Remember to be good to one another, and thanks again for listening.